Hi, and welcome to Our WWII Dad. I'm Chris Cangilla, and joined, of course, by Ken Cangilla, my brother. And this is our third full episode of our limited series that we created to try to share the stories of our father, Army Private First Class Louis Cangilla, who served in World War II in Europe. Now, in our last episode, we went over the origins of the 99th Infantry Battalion Separate that Dad was assigned to as a replacement soldier in 1944. And we also went over Dad's first action in the Canal Drive and, of course, in the Vercelin-Aachen battle. Now, Ken, you were able to see a lot of those places just a couple of weeks ago. What was that like?
Yeah, it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for me to travel to Europe and actually walk in the footsteps of Dad, see the exact locations that he was, and see the same sites that he saw. And, I had a terrific guy to help me out in Vercelin, Germany, a local man that showed us a lot of things. But I had done a lot of research in the years prior. And I kind of knew some pretty specific things about his group. And so after I left Vercelin, I was on my own. And so I did some digging and really was fortunate enough to discover some things that I wasn't sure I was going to be able to find. But I feel like I nailed them down. And I can't wait to share them with you today.
So let's jump right into it. So when we left off in our last episode, it was 9 days of battle. The guys were on the line for 9 days.
Yeah.
And then the 99th was, they're due for some rest. What did you learn about that?
Yeah. So they were certainly exhausted after those 9 days, but in the heat of the battle in mid-October, when they're entrenched in the town of Vercelin, my guide, Volker, was able to take me to a church that is still standing. It was not St. Sebastian, the one that was so heavily hit with artillery, but it was a church that was in good shape still. And he pulls up and he says, Ken, this church to your right, St. Marien, he said, your father slept there during the heated parts of the battle when things would calm down at night. They didn't have night vision goggles back in those days, so there wasn't as much fighting at night. And he said, your father slept in this church. So I got out, of course, got out of the Jeep, and we went into the church. It's now what's known as a columbarium, which is actually a facility where you can put the ashes of your loved ones in a niche. And so we were able to go inside and see what that looks like today. I'm sure it looks a lot different since they've changed it to that kind of facility. But it was really neat to be able to stand outside that church and think about, let's see, but then Dad was still 18. He wasn't quite 19 yet during that battle. He's 18-year-old Dad, having been a runner in that battle and getting shot at by MG-42s. Now he gets a chance to put his head down. And I just think about it. Was he able to sleep? With all that adrenaline going and the excitement of really his first biggest battle, was he able to get any rest? What did he think about? How long did that night last? Did he conk right out, or did he lay there awake wondering what the next day would bring?
Yeah, you bring up a very good point too. And Dad was a pretty religious man. So I wonder, a night in the church there, if that brought him more solace and just, spending a night somewhere else, maybe, in the warm embrace of God, for him.
Yeah.
Maybe that felt him, a little bit more.
Yeah, and I asked Volker. I said, "Is this and was this a Catholic church at the time?" He goes, "Yeah, it's a Catholic church and still is a Catholic church." So, probably meant a lot to Dad.
Absolutely. All right. So after that night he spent at St. Marien, do you know what happened next?
Yeah. So they're engaged in the battle for quite a few more days, as we recapped in our last episode. Which, if you haven't seen it, there were some great photographs in there, so go back and take a look at it. But yeah, so they finally get taken off the lines. They're exhausted, and they're trucked to the Henri-Chapelle area, which today has a big U.S. cemetery there. In fact, that's the cemetery that Volker, my German friend, takes care of 6 American graves there. Right. So they pause there for a day or two, kind of catch their breath, and then they push on through Liege, Belgium, down into this little town outside of Liege called Tilff, 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 Belgium, which is down there on the Orth River.
So, they moved off to Tilff. Did you get a chance to go see Tilff?
Yeah, so I had to say goodbye to Volker. It was great to spend the day with him, but he had to work, and I'm on vacation, so
Sure.
we were ready to venture out. And one of the ways that we decided to see these sites that Dad had been at was we rented a 24-foot RV out of Frankfurt, Germany, and we had driven up to Verselen and on the Aachen area to talk to Volker. Fortunately, we didn't have to drive around in the RV to see those sites. We were able to get in his World War II Jeep, but I had to drive the RV from then on to everything we were going to see, which, if you've ever driven in Europe, the roads are very narrow and the tunnels are not very tall. And so I'm driving a 24-foot long RV through areas that the tunnels, and everything's in meters, not feet. So you got to think differently. So I knew the height of our RV was about 2.9 meters. So I'm watching every single bridge and tunnel I go under to make sure it's at least 3 meters. And good old Google Maps tried to send me into a couple places I
Oh,
shouldn't have
geez.
been. But we're driving down through that way, and we get down through Liege, and we're driving along the Meuse River by Liege, and Liege is a fairly sizable Belgium town, and so there's traffic and everything, and the roads are so different to me, and so I'm in my lane going, and there's tons of bridges over the river. Well, they're sending me under the bridges alongside the river, and everyone I'm getting close to, I'm trying to read the sign on do I fit or not, and fortunately I did. But I looked like the biggest vehicle on those streets, and so my nerves were just frayed. And so we finally get out of Liege, we cross the Meuse River, and we're on the road into Tilff, and we pull into Tilff after just a nerve-wracking journey. And I said to my wife, I said, I'm fried. I just need to park. I need to get out and walk around. So we just
Of
pulled over and
course.
parked and got out and started to walk the streets.
Wow. How far was that drive from Versalen to Tilff? You
It felt
think?
like about 3 days, but
Yeah, I bet.
it was probably, I don't know the mileage exactly. It
Right.
probably took us maybe 3 hours to drive it.
Yeah.
We had some other stops along the way and
Sure.
things like that.
That's a long
Um,
way to go in a foreign country in an RV.
yeah,
And sure, you can see some of the signage and understand some of it, but not all
right.
of it. And then you
No,
have to be worried on top of that. It's even hard in America when you're driving a rental, truck through those
right.
viaducts and trying to get underneath there. So I can imagine what you're going through. So you're spent,
Yeah.
you're fried, and you pull over. What happened next?
So we pull over and we're on what's called their main street, which is like the road in front of your house,
Sure.
about that wide. And we pull over and we fold the mirrors in because I'm afraid somebody's going to, take the mirrors off. And I said, look, I saw this church as we were coming in. That's always the town square. Let's just go down there because I knew the 99th had been in Tilff somewhere. And I
Yeah.
always like to start at the church squares because that's the center of activity. So we get out and walk down the street to get to the church, and we're looking at the church, and there's a restaurant right there. And we're thinking, well, should we go in and have lunch? But the place is really packed. And so I look up on the street post, and I'm standing by the Orth River, and I look up on the street post, and it gives the address of the restaurant. And it says 10 Quai de la Orth is the address. And I look at that and I go, why does that sound so familiar? And so I had remembered when I went through Dad's belongings, he had saved this. They call them calling cards, like a business card we would use today, but it's a calling card. And I think a lot of people had them in the 40s. He had saved this calling card from a Madame Winand Cologne, I think is how you, or Colonde, I'm not sure how you say it. And she had given him this card for some reason. So it always intrigued me, like, why did Dad have this card? And I remembered when I saw Quai de la Orth, I thought that's the address on the card. So I pull up the card on my phone. I had a picture of it, and I see that it was at 32 Quai de la Orth
Oh my God.
is where the card was from.
Yeah.
So I'm like, we can't be far away. So we walk along the Orth River, gorgeous path along there, cobblestone, just like you'd picture, trees growing, just a gorgeous river. We're walking along, and we're looking at each of the houses that we go, and we're getting the addresses, and we go down probably about five blocks or so, and we finally get to the address of 32 Quai de la Orth. And I'm standing there looking at this house and just thinking, okay, I know they rested here. Dad's got this calling card from there. He must have stayed in this house in November of 1944 to rest and regroup.
That's nuts. Is it
Yeah.
the same house? I mean, is it still standing or is it different or?
The house is still standing. I was able to, before I left, I had looked and seen a picture on Google Maps. They do the street view, and I could
Yeah,
see it. And in that picture, it looked much like it probably did in 1944. And I don't know how old that was. But the way it looks today, it's been completely remodeled,
no.
and it just didn't look the same. So it was still neat to be in the same location, though. And from there, we walked more of the streets of Tilff and got to see some of the other buildings around there. There's a pub on the corner and stuff
Sure.
like that. And your mind just runs wild about these guys being in town for quite a long time and what their life was like during that time in Tilff.
Yeah. So going on that thread that you're talking about, how
Yeah.
long were they in Tilf? Right. How long did
Yeah.
their rest last?
Yeah. So they got to Tilff on November 23rd. So the Battle of Versland wrapped up right around Dad's birthday, around October 28th or so. So it took them a while to get down there as they went through Henri-Chapelle, so on and so forth. So they get down there and they're kind of re-gearing everything. They're on patrols to make sure that the Germans would parachute into places.
Sure.
So they wanted to make sure nobody was coming in behind the lines there. So they would go out on patrols, but recreationally, they had some free time. They played flag football. I've read accounts from guys that were there. They played flag football. They really got to know the families they were embedded with and forged relationships that lasted a lifetime afterwards.
Sure.
They spent Thanksgiving there. But the scariest moments for them there were these things they called buzz bombs. And they were a fairly new bomb that the Germans had created. And what it is it's the V1 rocket that they created,
Wow.
which is really the first cruise missile, if you think
Right.
about it.
Right.
And they launched them at London even. Well, during the night, they would launch these things toward Liege because it was more of an industrial center and they wanted to stop the Americans there. And being only 5 miles or so from Liege, those buzz bombs would go over Tilff all the time. And they were very distinct in what they sounded. That's the name buzz bombs. And they had a contrail behind them, and a
Yeah.
flame. So you could see them going through the night sky. And then when you couldn't see the flame anymore and the buzz sound stopped, you knew the bomb was on its trajectory downward. And if you heard it stop, you
They
ducked for
get
cover.
Yeah,
Yeah,
for sure.
exactly. And so a few of those fell short of Liege and fell in and around Tilff, and they were devastating. So that had to be very frightening to hear those things coming over. And Dad would talk about the buzz bombs. He'd also talk
Yeah.
about these things called screaming mimes, which is like the multiple rockets that they could launch. So the sounds of war really stuck with him because he would say these same things that soldiers still talk about today when they're,
Yeah.
thinking about it.
I remember, and this is a story that you probably don't recall, but we
Yep.
were on vacation and Dad was talking with an older woman that was from Great Britain.
Yeah.
And she was talking about, the what is it, the Blitz? Is that what happened in England when they're
Yeah.
bombed all the time?
When their bomb's called the Blitz. Yeah.
Yeah. And she was recalling that and just shuddering. I remember this as a young man. I was a young kid, actually, and she was just
Wow.
shuddering because of the sound. They
Yeah.
recall the sound. So
Yeah.
even when these soldiers are getting rest, they're not resting. There's
No.
sounds of war, and there's a
Yep.
threat right next door and
Right.
close by. What happened after Tilf?
Well, so they're probably getting into kind of settle in there, feeling pretty good, and getting good meals and everything. So December 17th rolls around, and they get an alert that they have 1 hour to leave their personal belongings, just gather all their war paraphernalia, and get on the trucks because they're moving out. And they're moving out to this little town called Malmedy, and they're moving east towards Germany.
Oh,
They've been called up to Malmedy for the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh my goodness. Now, the Battle of the Bulge, that was the battle and the main feature in that HBO series Band of Brothers, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there were a couple episodes in that feature that were about Bastogne.
Okay.
And Bastogne is a town in Belgium, and the distance between Bastogne and Malmedy was only 44 miles.
Oh, wow.
So Dad's and his troops and the 99th are not that far from Bastogne. And so if you look at a map of the Battle of the Bulge, there's a reason it's called the Battle of the Bulge, is because the Germans were pushing in from the east, and their objective was to cross the Meuse River and get up into to get the port in Belgium. And so they wanted to drive up that way. And so they put on this huge push. This was the biggest battle that's ever occurred in history. There were a million soldiers involved in this, counting both sides. So it was a huge, huge battle. So this is their final last gasp to try to win the war. So they're throwing everything they've got at it. So they pushed quickly west into Belgium, and they had moved so quickly that they had kind of pushed this bulge out, and Bastogne is right in the center of that bulge, and they're fully surrounded. And so that's what that episode of Band of Brothers is about, them being surrounded. But Dad's 99th Infantry Division is called up to Malmedy because there's basically 3 roads that will get them across the Meuse, and the Germans across the Meuse, and get them up to the port they want to take. So Dad is on the northern branch of that in Malmedy to block those routes of this big German push. And so they've got to get to Malmedy in a big hurry. And so they load up on the trucks and they head over to Malmedy, and they arrive there on the 17th. Some get there on the 17th. The others arrive on the 18th of December.
Wow. Now, you mentioned it earlier that you usually go and find these places by visiting the town square.
Yeah.
Did any of the action happen in the town square of Malmedy?
Yeah, there's a great old photo that I even have it on my desktop of my computer. I love it so much. It's a great photo of Company D, not C. Dad was in C, but it was Company D of the 99th when they pull in on December 17th. And it's the town square. You can see the obelisk in the middle of the town square. I think it's called the Prince Albert Obelisk or something like that. And the town square is, just beautiful, but it's got all these Jeeps and anti-tank guns parked in there. All this heavy equipment is pulled into the town square because they left in such a hurry. They didn't even really know what their assignment was. They were just like, get to Malmedy, because it was only being held by about 60 men that were in the engineer group. So these are guys that build bridges and stuff, but they dropped their hammers and grabbed their rifles. And so they were kind of hanging on till the 99th got there, and Dad's C Company arrived probably on the 18th. And it was so wonderful to step into that square.
Yeah, I want to talk about that because I remember, now that you're bringing it up, that you showed us this picture that you found of that Malmedy town square.
Yeah.
Gosh, maybe 2-3 years ago, pre-pandemic, I think, right?
Oh yeah, yeah.
And you showed that. I'm like, well, let me use my detective hat on there. So I looked at this amazing picture, 1944, in the trucks and all the things that are there. Yeah. And then I went on to Google Maps and Google Earth, and I dropped myself right in that spot. I found that spot. And sure enough, a lot of those same things are still there. The obelisk, the church in the background, and it's amazing. I mean, you can take a look at it and see it right there. And then you went to that same spot, right?
Yeah, that was probably the quintessential moment for me to have walked right into that square, found that exact spot where that photo's taken. And of course, I had to have my wife take a picture of me standing there like an idiot. But you got to do it. And it's just beautiful. It's just a quaint village. You can tell it's kind of a resort town that's used a lot in the summer, kind of like our mountain resort towns or stuff up in Wisconsin for you guys. People go up there to cool off. So it's just a beautiful, quaint little town with this beautiful cathedral in the background.
It looks a lot like Breckenridge, or even the towns out here near Chicago that, like St. Charles or Geneva, these older towns that existed on their own outside of these large cities.
Right. Yeah. So it was a really neat town to see and stand in that square and explore the surrounding area. We spent quite a bit of time that day there. Yeah.
That's nuts. Now, you discovered some other things when you pulled over near some railroad tracks, right?
Yeah. So, driving an RV, you got to find a place to park it every night. The good thing is you don't have to find a hotel room, but the bad thing is you got to find a place to park. Fortunately, in Europe, they're really camper friendly. That's cool. And so we had a great app that we used that would tell us places to park. So Dawn was my navigator. My wife's my navigator. She's finding these places for us. And she says, okay, drive up this road and, you pull in here, and there's supposed to be a lot there that for like €5, you can spend the night. So we finally find it and we pull in there and we park for the night. And so that night, I had good internet signal. So I start, reading stuff again about Malmedy and things like that. And I'm reading excerpts from various books about Dad's troops. And I'm just going to read you just one excerpt that
Sure.
I printed out that I think is really good. So this is from the book called The Viking Battalion. It actually hasn't come to press yet. I've seen a preview copy of it. And it's a collection of memoirs from the 99 soldiers that Dad soldiered with. And it's edited by Eric Brune and a couple other guys that worked through it to make sure it all made sense.
And Eric works on that Facebook page, right?
Yes, he heads up the 99th Facebook page. He's very involved in this. He's a great historian.
That's great.
Yeah. So this is an excerpt from a soldier named John W. Kelly, and he is in C Company. So Dad probably knew this man because they're in the same company. So he says, we deployed along a high railroad bank that crossed a long valley. C Company dug in along the hill on the left side of the valley. The men had hardly begun to settle in when the first enemy came into view. The riflemen held their fire for a time because American 2.5-ton trucks and M3 scout cars led the way. Soon, the Jerrys opened up with an American 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the lead truck, and the shooting began. So part of the Battle of the Bulge, part of it was they kept American vehicles. They put on American uniforms. They infiltrated into these towns. They turned signs to confuse us. They sent troops the wrong way. And what they did is they used guys that could speak very good English that sounded like Americans that were probably, the fatherland called some of these Germans back from America, and some of them went.
We saw that in Band of Brothers.
Exactly.
One of the first couple episodes. I remember that.
That's exactly right. So they had guys that could speak very good American English. So Dad's facing these American trucks and coming at him with American machine guns. So they kind of hesitate until they start shooting at us. Right. Yeah, shooting at our guys. So the rest of the story goes on. He goes, they paused because American 2.5-ton trucks and M3 scout cars led the way. Soon the Jerrys open up with an American 50 cal machine gun mounted on the lead truck, and the shooting began. Everyone fired for all he was worth, and the German infantry came on. German tanks began coming down the road to the left of the valley, and the lead tank knocked out the right anti-tank gun of ours that was placed at the left side of B Company. So B Company's on the C Company's right, and then C Company's here. So that anti-tank gun is knocked out. The anti-tank gun on our right scored a direct hit on a German tank, knocking it out and causing it to skid across the road and block the road. One more tank was damaged, and the balance of the German troops withdrew to take up defensive positions to the rear. Mortar and artillery fire came into our lines, and some also fell in the area of where the enemy was because they had advanced so quickly towards our line. So the German artillery hit their own guys for a little bit.
Right. The fake Americans that they did, they're probably hitting those guys because they were there. And the thing is, too, it looks like that if that tank didn't block the road, it could have been a horrible, horrible, thing for the Americans there, right?
The amount of forces and the amount of tanks that the Germans sent into this were just incredible. I mean, they threw everything they had at it. So, and it turns out when we capture some soldiers, we find out what we're fighting is the 1st SS division of the German army. These guys were the really hard cases. Yeah, they were the really seasoned soldiers. Yeah, just the really the toughest of them all. Wow. So they're fighting the German SS. So the last paragraph he writes is, for a half an hour the battle raged. Trucks were knocked out, and infantry lay strewn across the floor of the valley. This is what Dad's looking down on. Bullets ricocheted off the steel rails of the railroad and thudded into the bank. Fighting was fierce, but the line held, and the nearest German soldier was killed by fragments of a hand grenade, which means that's how close the action is. Yeah, wow. As far as you can throw a hand grenade.
So my burning question is,
yeah.
Did you just happen to park in the same area that this all took place?
Well, that's what's interesting is, when I'm reading this, I get out that morning and I'm looking, and we're in this parking lot, and it's a bus stop now where this building is. And I'm looking at the building, and I've been in Europe long enough to recognize what train stations look like because they live by the train there.
Sure. And
I'm looking at the bus depot, and it's a train station, you can tell. And then there's a walking path that is perfectly straight, and it's on the maps. It's called Line 45. Ligne is how they spell it, Line 45. And as you look at it, you can clearly see that that's where the railroad tracks were. They've been torn up, turned into a walking path and a bike path, and we're literally parked a grenade throw away
Jeez.
from where those railroad tracks are. Now, I don't know if Dad was exactly there, but he was awfully close to that spot.
And you could have picked any place to pull in for the night that offered, the RV parking,
Yeah,
and you happen
yeah.
to pick this one. Do you ever get the sense, and it's kind of spiritual in a way, but do
Yeah.
you ever get sense that Dad's finger is on your back, kind of guiding you where to go?
You have to wonder about that. For one thing, one of the first things I did was I found a penny somewhere,
Of
and
course.
pennies from heaven. So I found a penny. It wasn't even an American penny. I still have it here in my office. I found a penny, and then in Tilff, where we parked the RV, turned out to be just 3 blocks from where he rested his head in November of 1944. And then now we parked the RV up by these abandoned railroad tracks where he was in a big battle at Malmedy. And I had repeated these stories to my son Kyle. He goes, Dad, it's gravity. He goes, Grandpa's pulling you via gravity to those locations. He goes, it's got to be something like that. So
Yeah.
he echoed your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So we're in the middle of December, right? And
Yeah.
the holidays were fast approaching. Do you know anything about what Christmas was like for the 99th in our World War II, Dad?
Yeah, I did find some things out. And, when you think of Christmas, you think of church bells, right? So one of the excerpts I read from these memoirs was when the Americans pulled into Malmedy, the church bells were playing Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Nice.
Okay, yeah. But the question was, were they playing it because it was a welcome, or was it a warning to tell exactly? Because you got to remember, Belgium is a country that is very split between Germans and the French. They've fought over it for years. It's kind of that halfway in between. So you got French loyalties and you got German loyalties. So that was interesting about the church bells. But yeah,
let me ask you this.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I always think about this during the holidays, especially at Christmas. Was there a ceasefire at all?
No, there was not. There was not. So let me set the stage for why there wasn't a ceasefire. Okay. So the Battle of the Bulge took place in the worst winter ever in Belgium's history in the last 40 years or so leading up to that. So there's snow on the ground. It's very cold. That picture on December 17th is dry, and it began snowing, on the 18th or 19th. So the snow's building up. The soldiers are all embedded where they need to be. And so Christmas is rolling around. I'm sure they're getting excited for that, hope for packages from home. But it wasn't to be. They're on the lines, and it's Christmas Eve, and one of the soldiers that was in a different company, he's in his memoirs, he talks about reading from the Bible that night on Christmas Eve. And then, I often thought, what was Dad's Christmas like? And so over time, I'd found a picture of a chaplain giving a service on, like in a shed with a Jeep there. He's got the sacrament laid on the hood of the Jeep, and there's a bunch of soldiers there. I often thought of that photo. Well, I found a memoir from another one of the soldiers, a guy named J. Jarvis Taylor, and he writes about what took place on that Christmas. And I just want to read you a paragraph from that because it's really well written.
Sure.
So the night before, he says, he's sitting there upon the straw. I had the privilege of reading to our group the Christmas story as recorded in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of Luke. After we sang Silent Night and we said a prayer, we sat there quietly, reflecting upon the season and thinking of home and our loved ones. The next morning was Christmas. The kitchen crew managed to get up to us with a hot breakfast. It consisted of pancakes only. I only had 2 or 3, and that was all I had the whole day. After the good meal, the whole company, except those on detail, gathered in the hayloft of a nearby barn where the chaplain was holding Christmas services. He was accompanied by his assistant, who played the portable organ. We sang many of the familiar hymns and Christmas songs and listened to the chaplain's message.
Wow, it's just incredible that, these guys did not have good Christmases at all, but they made
No.
the best of what they could have. So no
So
ceasefire, right?
no ceasefire. So think of this as I read that paragraph, and I know this is going to jog a memory for you. So Dad was most likely in that same setting or something very similar because that's the 99th that's with that chaplain. I imagine there's only one chaplain embedded with him, I would think. So Christmas takes place in a hayloft, right? What's the nativity scene?
Yeah.
Takes place in the manger, the hayloft, and things like that. Okay, what did Dad build a lot of us and gave to us around Christmas? What do you
Yeah,
remember about
he,
that?
he built nativity scenes, right? He
Mm-hmm.
built the barns, if you will,
Yep.
and
Yep.
like doing that. So I'm wondering if you're making a good point. Did that memory come back of those things that he experienced in the war
Yep.
as well as
Yep.
of his religious background? For
And
sure.
remember, he would line them with straw, and he had
Mm-hmm.
straw on the roof and everything. And when I read this, one of the things I thought about was your cat sitting on the roof
Yeah,
of your manger scene, and I thought
yeah,
that was just a great memory. But it really struck with me, like, okay, did he make those because he was thinking back? And so every Christmas, I always think back to Dad being in that miserable situation. And a lot of people visit graves on the date of death. I always go visit Dad's grave around Christmas because of these stories that
yeah,
really strike a chord with me. Yeah,
yeah. It's powerful. It's
yeah,
extremely powerful.
yeah. Yeah. So back to your question on did they get any rest? No, they didn't get any rest. In fact, the Germans even attack on Christmas Day. So no rest for them. But
They
what is in?
attacked. I'm sorry. They attacked on Christmas Day.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
unbelievable.
Yeah. So they probe the lines, they launch artillery, et cetera. So our guys, are having to be in their foxholes on Christmas Day, eating K rations in a frozen foxhole. That's Christmas Day for our guys. So that really was what was happening at that point in time. But there was a reason that they had to have church in a barn and not in the cathedral. And the reason is that Malmedy, starting on December 23rd, for either 2 or 3 nights, there's some discrepancies, Malmedy was heavily, heavily bombed to the point where that square where I stood and the old picture is basically flattened, and the cathedral's damaged, but it was all, heavy stonework. It stood, but the square was essentially flattened by a bombing.
Wow. So what you've told me about this whole situation is that the Germans were shelling the outskirts of Malmedy where our
Right.
soldiers were kind of encamped.
Yeah.
But you're saying there's shelling that was taking place in the town square there?
Yeah, and it wasn't just shelling, it was actual bombing. And the
Oh, wow.
sad part of it is, Chris, is there's something called the fog of war, which means, you can get turned around, you make mistakes because there's so much going on and the adrenaline's flowing. The bombing that happened in Malmedy was US planes bombed our own positions in
Oh,
Malmedy.
my God.
Now, most of our soldiers were not in town because they were out protecting on the outskirts of town. But the bombing that occurred there killed quite a few civilians, and our guys rushed in to aid them. And it was really a horrific thing. And it didn't occur on just one night, it was at least 2 and maybe 3 nights that
Oh,
it
geez.
occurred. Yeah. So it was a terrible bombing. So while I'm there, I was aware of this bombing, but I didn't know the fortitude of it until I got back and really kind of dug for some pictures of it. And while I'm there, I'm walking behind the cathedral, and I did not know about this till I stumbled upon it. There's this cave, natural cave behind the cathedral, and I walk up to it, and there's a plaque that says, this cave was used by the citizens of Malmedy during the bombings of December of 1944, to seek refuge. And this cave is not very big. It's probably, I don't know, 20, maybe 30 feet deep by 10 feet wide. Over 300 civilians crammed themselves in there to escape the horrific bombing that was occurring. And then there's another plaque outside of there that's very touching. It lists the civilians that were killed, and some of them are families and kids and
Oh,
things like
geez.
that. So it was very, very tragic what took place there. And so that's why church took place in a hayloft and not the cathedral, because of the bombing that had occurred.
Wow. Do you think that the 99th knew it was the Americans that did that bombing, or do they think it was the Germans? Would they know?
So the Germans had been flying over Malmedy quite a bit and strafing and things like that. So they were used to hearing the German planes. In fact, I'll tell you a quick side story about the Messerschmitt.
What's a Messerschmitt?
So a Messerschmitt is like a German fast attack plane. It's not a bomber; it's more of an attack plane, and it's got machine guns in the nose, et cetera. It was very, very deadly vehicle, very, very, very deadly plane. And anyway, our guys did shoot down one of them. In fact, there's a picture in Howard Bergen's book of a downed Messerschmitt near Malmedy, and that's what reminded me of this story that Dad told about the Messerschmitt and his involvement with one. So what he told me is he is walking down the railroad tracks, and this is why I think it's Malmedy, because their whole defense was along the railroad tracks. So he might have been a runner going from one to the other, but he's walking down the railroad tracks, and I think he's got one or two other guys with him. And so they're going down the tracks to try to get from point A to point B, and they look up. First they hear, and then they look up, and here's a Messerschmitt coming at them at 12 o'clock low.
My God.
And yeah, and it's on them in no time at all. And he said that by the time that they reacted, of course, they jumped to the side of the tracks. By the time they reacted, the plane was gone. And the only reason he can think of is that they weren't strafed, was that the guy was probably just completely out of ammo. And so he got really lucky on those railroad tracks in Malmedy.
Hey, do you think they were using those railroad tracks because of the snow cover and trying to navigate where they're going? I mean, that's one thing that they could probably feel with their feet, or at least see a little bit, right?
Yeah, the snow was so deep. I'm sure if any rail cars had moved through there, would have packed the snow down and helped. And it was a great way to find your direction. So I'm sure they used the tracks to help guide them along. Yeah, and they didn't have far to go, but they were right in the in a battle that was going on, and that's why the timing of that plane was unfortunate. But luckily, he was out of ammo.
Wow, got lucky there.
Yeah. Yeah. So, back to the bombing, the American planes that came over, our troops could hear their engines and knew that they were American planes before the bombs dropped. And they thought they were just on their way over further into the east side towards the border with Germany. And of course, they dropped their payload on the wrong town. The investigation showed that the towns were similar in size, that the navigators got confused with the terrain and dropped by mistake. Our soldiers, after the first night, they hung bed sheets up on the roofs of any buildings that were standing, trying to warn them off. And they still got bombed at least a second or third time. So it was a devastating bombing that took place there.
And we think about this in our terms in 2023 of being able to communicate with these forces, but
yeah,
they couldn't communicate, right? And that's probably why it went on for 2 or 3 days.
Yeah, I'm sure they tried to send communications up the line, but that bomber group, I don't know how far away that they had to get the communication. Them communication lines were broken all the time by artillery shells, and so you can't just drive somewhere and tell somebody the terrain's too difficult, and who knows where they're flying out of, So yeah, it's not like today where you just radio and say, "Hey, you're in the wrong place." No, that's why it took a while to correct.
And you have GPS and everything back. You didn't have that stuff back then. They were navigating by, objects on the ground or stars or whatever they used. Right.
Yeah, it was very difficult. So it's understandable, but it's very unfortunate for the loss of life there. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah. So that fight that he was in Malmedy there, was that the worst of it for Dad in the 99th?
Well, I think one of the toughest things he had to do is in C Company, they were sent on a commando raid to head towards the German troops in this little town called Hédomont. And when I say town, it's probably 3 buildings, and it's literally, as the crow flies, only 1.5 miles from Malmedy. So what they did is they had the artillery try to soften up the targets, and then it was a commando raid. They just went zipping in there, and their objective was they wanted them to get some prisoners to try to find out, what are the plans, where are they coming from, because they were almost surrounded. All the roads were being probed by the Germans because they wanted to get through there. So they attack Hédomont, and all of the 99th guys survived. They killed 30 German soldiers, and they captured one and brought him back for questioning, and were able to find out that, hey, this is the strength of the group. This is what their plan of attack is, et cetera. So it was very beneficial. So that probably had to be one of the worst parts for Dad. But probably the worst thing that happened in that area is a historical event called the Malmedy Massacre. And I had known about this before I left. And so I wanted to make a visit to that site because there's a war memorial there dedicated to the Malmedy Massacre. And we were able to tour that war memorial. And it was very touching to see the names of the soldiers killed there, and that somebody had even left fresh flowers there. So it was probably a family member. So As I looked at the memorial, I reminisced about what had taken place there. So the story is this: there were about 30 vehicles of B Company of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Unit, and they were traveling from northern Belgium down towards St. Vith, is where they were called to. And they weren't heavily armed or anything like that. They're just 30 vehicles. And so they stop in this cafe to ask directions. And while they're in the cafe, one of the soldiers that's outside runs in and tells whoever's in charge of the unit, hey, we got German tanks like in the lines right on us. And by the time they get out there, they're being fired upon, and they just weren't positioned. They were coming from their rear. They weren't positioned with their guns. They basically had to surrender. So a great number of men had to surrender. I think the total count is somewhere like 180 to 200 men
Wow.
had to surrender to the Germans. So they surrendered the Germans right there in this little town, this little crossroads town of Bagnères. And they're surrendered and they're marched out into this field. And the SS division pulls up in their tanks and their armored cars with their machine guns, and they just mow them down and they murder them out in the field. All these men standing there, just a terrible atrocity. And part of the story is, because a few of the guys survived to tell the tale, part of the story is about a dozen guys split from the group as soon as the machine guns open up, and they run back into the cafe that the commander was in originally, and they take cover there because it's this stone building that's reinforced. They thought, okay, they don't have any weapons left, but they could take refuge in there. So while I'm there, I stand at the field where the men were gunned down, and there's a historical picture of when they investigated the massacre. They're uncovering the snow off of the bodies, and behind the bodies, you can see this stone building that the 12 soldiers took cover in. And what's tragic about it is the Germans burnt the roof on the building to force them out. When the timber started coming down, they run out and they gunned those 12 down as well. So I stood there, I looked at the building in the background of that massacre picture, and lo and behold, I look out in the field. The building is still there. It's not a cafe, it's a home now, and it's been expanded upon. But there's no doubt when you look at the roof line and the shape of the windows that that's the same building that we lost 12 of our young men in that day, in addition to another 83 that were gunned down in the field.
Wow, that's just horrific. You think about the horrors of war, and it seems almost like it's accepted when there's losses on both sides. It's not great. You don't want ever to have that, but it seems, that's just what war is, unfortunately. But when men are gunned down in cold blood that they thought were going to be marched off to a POW camp or something like that,
right?
It's just the worst of human behavior.
Yeah. And the interesting thing, Chris, is about 40 of the guys, played dead and were able to survive until nightfall. And the Germans had pulled off, and they didn't know whether they didn't even want to move or look up. So they wait till nightfall and they scurry off into the woods, creek bottoms, wherever they could go. Well, one of the soldiers that survived, he works his way into Malmedy on December 18th, which is the day Dad arrives in Malmedy. And this soldier is basically rescued by the 99th, given treatment, and he's telling the story of what happened. And the American soldiers could not believe it. And of course, nobody had time to investigate till after the war, or not till after the war, but till after the battle.
That battle, yeah.
They went up there and investigated, and they discovered all these bodies of 83 men just murdered in cold blood, and another 40 were able to escape and tell the tale. And of course, there were war crime trials after the war to, take care of what had taken place that day.
That's just so horrific, so horrible. So how long was this whole Malmedy effort? How long did those battles last?
Yeah, so Dad gets there on December 17th or 18th and fights in Malmedy almost the entire time, but they're moved around January 10th or so, actually west of Malmedy, back towards France, to Stavelot to protect there, because the Germans were making inroads there. So it was utter chaos with the Germans infiltrating lines. They were coming in from the east and from the south. And so Dad goes to Stavelot to do a little bit more fighting there before things finally wrapped up in late January. The Battle of the Bulge was over. And what kind of was the beginning of the end is Patton's 4th Armored Division finally worked its way up. Well, they did did it pretty quickly in a couple of days, worked their way up to Bastogne to break the gridlock there because our guys were surrounded there. That got the Germans on the run. And then with cleanup operations, we finally had pushed them back into Germany by pretty much the end of January.
That's unbelievable. It's quite an ending to 1944. I mean, they were able to celebrate Christmas as best they could. And then the 99th was kind of in it thick in December. And here we are to a new year. So, when we return for our next episode, it's going to be a brand new year. And of course, the 99th is on the move again, as they always seem to be, right? Moving back and forth across Europe. But they have VE Day on the horizon for them and for our World War II dad. Thanks for watching and listening to Our World War II Dad. Please remember to like and subscribe and turn on that notification bell so you don't miss an episode.
And if you're just listening to the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review. We would really appreciate it.